Okay, well, today we're in this book called The Greatest Life of All, Jesus. And we've heard some stuff about it. And as we do sometimes for the teaching, we're going to combine a couple of chapters. But the chapters that we're going to focus on today talk about the Sabbath and God and his relationship to us and what all that means. And I don't know if you're like me, we've heard stories all along. And my case started with a little kid. We learned Bible stories, and you heard all this stuff, and you read the parables and the stories of what Jesus did, and you think, well, yeah, that's what happened. We understand that. But I have no clue as to why it happened. I really didn't understand the history about what was going on. I mean, we know the Romans had conquered Jerusalem, and so there were Romans involved in this process, and there were Jews and all this kind of stuff. But what Swindoll, Charles Swindoll, who's the author of this book, is trying to do for us is give us some more background of what was going on in the times that all of the Bible was written. What's the history about it? You know, last week Vicki talked along these lines a little bit, but it really struck more to me when I was reading some of the books in this Bible. And I thought about things that happened. Don't show of hands, but how many of you, just think to yourself, when you were young, knew somebody who had a divorce? You know they split up. You know things didn't go right. You really didn't know what happened. I mean, we read about divorces on Facebook and the news and all the TV shows of the celebrities that break up. And you hear about, all you have to do is go through the grocery store line and there's somebody who's talking about their ex or this or whatever. But we don't really always know what happened. But there is a backstory to all of those things that happen. There's a backstory to the Bible. What happened? Why did things happen the way they do? So some of what Swindoll shares with us is the backstory of what was happening at the time of Christ. Who were these people? What were they? What made it happen? So the first person he talks about is Levi. Now, does everybody know who Levi was? I guarantee you, everybody in this room knows who Levi was. And we're not talking about Levi Strauss, who made jeans. He's got jeans on today. We're not talking about Levi Johnson, who was the cornerback for the Detroit Lions in the 73, 75 season, 76 season, although it is Super Bowl Sunday.
Levi Strauss and his jeans.
Yeah. And we're not even talking about Levi the Slasher video game. So, okay, here we go. Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Levi was the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Levi was the third son of Jacob. Remember, the 12 sons, Joseph was the youngest one, was sold into slavery. Levi was the son of Alphaeus. Everybody know who Alphaeus was? I've never heard of him. Levi was a publican. That doesn't mean he was a British pub owner. It means he was a tax collector in the time of Romans. They were called publicans. He probably spoke Arabic and Greek so that he could deal with all the people he was collecting taxes from. Because he was a tax collector, he had to work with the Romans. And as such, the Jews basically hated his guts. I mean, who here likes the tax collectors today? Anybody got an IRS friend? You know Levi by another name. His name was Matthew. He was one of the 12 disciples. In the chapter 9 of his book, says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he said. And he told Matthew, and Matthew got up and followed him. Now, Mark tells basically the same story, but he uses the name Levi. Now, we think of Matthew, and if you listen to that story, Matthew just gave up everything he was doing, and he picked up his stuff, and he went off to follow Jesus. Who else did that in the Bible? We hear several of the fishermen who did that. They laid down their nets and they followed Jesus. Now, have you ever really thought about what that meant? I mean, if you're a fisherman and you're providing for your family, sure, that's one thing. But Levi, Matthew, was a tax collector. So when he picked up his stuff and left, the Jews might have been happy, but the Romans were not happy. I suspect some of the Romans wanted to have a personal conversation with Matthew. What did you do with the money you already collected? Why aren't you collecting more money for us? You can't just get up and leave. It was a challenge for the fishermen to get up and leave, but for Levi, there was a real risk. I mean, what are his Roman overseers going to say when he just walks away? I mean, I've never yet found a government that doesn't want to just give up taxes. As we go along, Swindoll talks a little bit about the Pharisees. And the second half of this story was that after Levi or Matthew leaves, and while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and the disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and with sinners?" And on hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. To go learn what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to save not the righteous, but the sinners." In the words of my formerly 16-year-old son, the Pharisees were pissed. He's doing everything that's unclean. Why aren't you hanging out at the church? Why aren't you with the nice people? You're hanging out with sinners. And Jesus said, who needs help? It's not the nice people that need help. Religion has been used throughout history by governments to do a lot of things. The Romans were really good at it. They used religion as a way to control the people. If you can control the message, and you can control what people believe in, and you can control who's saying that, you can control people. Now, in the first century of Israel, there were two main groups that were involved, and we've all heard about them. There's the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up as a kid and I heard all these stories about the Sadducees and Pharisees, I never really paid much attention to what was the difference. They were just all bad guys. I don't really care. But the only thing I really learned in this lesson as I went through this is I did finally learn how to spell the name Pharisee. Don't ask me about Sadducees. I didn't get that far. But they were both the bad guys. Now the Sadducees, they held official positions. They were in charge of the temple. They were the guys who ran the temple. And if you remember, at the time of Christ, the temple was a great thing. Herod the first had built this temple for the Jews. The remains of it are what are still there today. But the Sadducees were the guys in charge of running this thing. They controlled who got in, they controlled who got out. All of the stuff that happens, that was their power base. And as such, the Sadducees, because they were running the temple that was built by Herod, who was under the Roman rules, the Sadducees were in with the Romans. So they didn't necessarily do what the Romans wanted, but they were the ones who had a buddy-buddy relationships with the Romans. If you remember, when Jesus was called, the high priests and the Sadducees, they were the ones that took him to the Romans. The Pharisees were the second big group. They were really influential with people because the reason they were influential is they were the ones who were the keepers of the law. They were the ones who told everybody and set the example. You all probably remember this verse of scripture. It's from Luke. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, and one was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood all by himself and prayed, and he said, "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like these other people. I'm not like the robbers or the evildoers or the adulterers, or I'm not even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give to the church 1/10 of all that I have." Can't you see this guy? I see him on television. Right? He's a preacher in one of the gospel programs that are out there today, and he's saying, "Look at me, look how great I am, I'm doing it all right." That's who the Pharisees were. Now, the people had to kind of follow them because the Pharisees were the keeper of the rules. And nobody, and the other thing about the Pharisees didn't like Rome. The Sadducees, they were sort of in bed with the Romans, but the Pharisees weren't. The Pharisees were, at best, confrontational with Rome. And the Romans needed to control the Jews. So the Romans played the Pharisees and Sadducees against each other and worked with them. They helped one or helped the other, or, we see it all the time with governments. They figure out who's in power. And the Romans didn't want to have to mess with this. Just, your conquered people, just get along. And to enforce that, yeah, we have a garrison of Romans, but we're going to also work with these other guys in power. One of the things that the Pharisees used to help maintain their status, there were lots of rules at the time, but the Pharisees latched on to the fourth commandment, the 10 Commandments. The fourth one says, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath. It's to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor your female servant, nor animals," blah, 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 blah. "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. And on the seventh he rested. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy." That was the commandment. Any idea what it means to keep the Sabbath? What does it mean to you to keep the Sabbath? How many of you, when you were a little kid, your parents let you go to the movie on Sunday? How many of you remember Blue Laws? As recently as the 70s, I can remember here in Houston going in the grocery store on Sunday, and there'd be aisles that were blocked off. You couldn't go down those aisles and buy those things. Anything else anybody remembers from Blue Laws?
You could buy a hammer, but you couldn't buy anything else.
He said you could buy a hammer, but you couldn't buy nails.
I grew up in a little town in West Virginia, but well into my high school years, you really couldn't buy much of anything on Sunday. The whole downtown was shut.
Here's an interesting bit of trivia. Way back in 1781, there was a guy named Samuel A. Peters who published a work called The General History of Connecticut. And in that, it was purported to show all the Sabbath regulations that you could have for the city of New Haven, what you could do and not do. And guess what? It was printed on blue paper. Some people believe that's the source of the word Blue Laws. 1781. Now, there are also, at that time in the 18th century, when somebody referred to something blue, they were also referring to a rigid moral code of some sort. So, nobody knows for sure where that name comes from, but there is some history in that process.
It's a good story if you get somebody to believe it.
Yeah! Put it on the internet and everybody says it's fact, right? Originally, God made the seventh day to commemorate his creation. And the Sabbath is the Hebrew word that's based on the meaning of the word to cease, to stop, to end. God's purpose in creating the Sabbath was to show and declare that his creation was good. And at the time, when it was originally way back long before Christ, the Sabbath was a day for feasting and celebration. Families gathered together and they said, you know, our God is a great God. Look at what he has done for us. But things changed. Most of us remember somewhere there's a story that, you know, the Babylonians came in about 570 BC and conquered Israel. And they took them off to Babylonia. And up till that time, Israel wasn't just a way of thought, it was a nation. And their identity was their nation and their people and the things they believed in. But now they're hauled off into captivity and they can't be a nation. They can't be what they are. So what became some rules now became part of the things that identified who they were. And our writer says that this is about the time that the Phariseeum or whatever you want to call it, that idea of Pharisee started to grow. Because they said, I can be different. I can live in Babylonia. I'm under their rule, but I can be different. I can be unique. I can be a Hebrew. I can be a Jew because I follow all these rules. And by that time, by the time they come back and 500 years go by and it's the time of Christ, if you think about just the rules relating to the Sabbath, that one rule that says keep Sabbath holy had become a long list. You couldn't buy nails. You couldn't carry things, you couldn't burn things, you couldn't extinguish things, you couldn't write things, you couldn't erase things. There's a pattern here. You couldn't do one, you couldn't do the other. Didn't matter. Altogether, there was one, you couldn't do chain stitching. All of our sewers and quilters. Not on Sunday. You couldn't sew, you couldn't knead, you couldn't spin, you couldn't dye. You couldn't shear, you couldn't... Altogether, there were 39 things that you couldn't do on Sunday or the Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees had nothing on Samuel Peters, who we mentioned. His list of blue laws had 45 things on it you couldn't do.
One interesting thing is blue laws still exist in Texas in one area, automobile sales. You can be open on Saturday and not Sunday, or you can be closed on Saturday and open on Sunday, but not both days.
Not both days. Chick-fil-A. You know, when I think of all these rules that the Pharisees had and the Jews had, all I can think of is the U.S. government. You know, if you've ever looked, the Constitution, which is supposedly everything we are, has 4 pages. Today, the federal government published, just the federal government, not state, local, city, municipal, homeowners district, nothing. Just the federal government has something called the Code of Federal Registers, where they publish all the rules, all the laws we have. Anybody know how big it is today? Today, it has 196,000 pages. So we went from 4 pages of the Constitution to 200,000 pages.
Wow.
And it's estimated to grow at about 8% per year. So can you imagine what it's going to be like in 50 years? Brennan Manning, who was an American author, a former priest and public speaker, made the following statement. He wrote this: "The Pharisees installed the cold demands of rule-ridden perfection because that approach gives them status and control. Religion becomes the tool to intimidate and enslave rather than liberate and empower." And he went on to say, talks a little bit more, but he says the joyous creation and celebration of the covenant had disappeared. And the Sabbath had become a day of legalism. And here's the thing, this is what the professor says, write this down in your book. The means had become the end. instead of us celebrating the Sabbath, celebrating our relationship with God, all of these rules and all of these regulations and all of these problems had become what you had to do. And nobody was willing to challenge the Pharisees. They were the guys in power. You know, if you were the Catholic faith and you challenged the Catholic faith, what did they do? They excommunicated you. They said, you're out of here. If you challenged the Jewish people, you would be blocked from getting into the temple and castigated and looked down on and all this stuff. So what happens? At this point in time, who comes along to challenge all those rules from the Pharisees? Jesus. If you remember, it says one Sabbath, this is from Mark, Jesus and his disciples were going through the grain fields. And as disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to them, look, what they're doing. It's unlawful and they can't do it on the Sabbath. And he answers, have you ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, they entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread. They, remember we did a thing on the temple. There was this thing of bread and nobody could touch it. Just one priest could touch it. David and his guys went in there and chowed down. They ate it. And the Pharisees, to this day, David's the guy in Jewish history. Jesus said, look what David did. Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man was made for the Sabbath. So as they go along, Jesus is the first one to come along and challenge this stuff that's going on, this control that the Pharisees and Sadducees have. As I was doing this thing, I stumbled across a verse in Deuteronomy, and it made me stop and think. This is just a little aside, but the Pharisees were not alone in all the things that they did. If you read Deuteronomy number 23, one of the rules from the Old Testament says, if a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to the master. Let them live among you wherever they like and whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. Anybody remember the U.S. Constitution? It officially recognized that slaves could enforce, that states could enforce slavery upon slave laws. As recently as the 1850s, shortly before the Civil War, there was the Fugitive Slave Act, which specifically said if a slave runs away from the South to the North to a non-slave state, the people in the North had to return that slave to the slavery in the South. Did we miss something somewhere along the way? Not here to have a commentary on that, but just to point out, the Pharisees aren't the only ones that do things that probably they shouldn't do. Back to Jesus. He rebuked the Pharisees. He said, you're giving more priority to the laws of man than the laws of God. Again, what did it say? It said, keep the Sabbath holy. Does not sowing keep the Sabbath holy? What do we have here on our wall? We've got a quilt that was sewn. Well, why do we have it here? Because we remember people, but it's an honor to God. God gave the laws to his people to bless them, not to burden them. Every rule that's in God's rules is designed to elevate the quality of human life, to restore the relationship between God and man. All through the Bible we read, what does God really want? God wants to be in relationship with us. That's what he's looking for. He wants to be best buds. He wants to hang out with us. Whether it's in church, whether it's in our home, whether we're sitting there watching the football game with them. What do we want to do with our best friends? What do we want to do with the most important people in our lives? A lot of us here are grandparents. How many of you, raise your hand, have gone on a trip to go visit your grandchildren somewhere for Christmas or Thanksgiving or during the summer? Anybody ever done that? Even if it's across town. Hey, you can drive across town to Houston if it's a trip, right? Jesus didn't come to establish a new religion. He came to restore a broken religion. He came to restore those broken relationships. The people weren't relating to God, they were relating to the church. Our author says the primary purpose of the law was to love God and to enjoy Him forever. Yeah, we can do things to help us along, but when we lose sight of that, we lose sight of what we're trying to do. So we get to the Bible verse that's really important today. You've all heard this. It's from Matthew. Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Where does Jesus call us to come? Where does He invite us to? He doesn't invite us to come to church. He doesn't invite us to come to the temple or to follow rituals. He's not telling us to sacrifice or to vow of poverty or penance or pilgrimages or any of the other things that organized religions have promoted. He's saying, come to me. That's His invitation. It's simple. So let's talk about invitations. What does an invitation have? Well, the first thing you have is, who's it from? Jesus' invitation is from God. He stakes out His claim that He's God. In Matthew, He says, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, to whom the Son chooses to reveal Him. He's starting in this whole story with His apostles to tell them, I'm God. In John 14, He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. You know, he's telling us, I'm God. So he's deliberately, His invitation, come to me. Who's making the invitation? God's making the invitation. Who's He sending that invitation to? Obviously, it's you and me and everyone. He originally was talking to the Jews. Jesus was a Jew. He was in Jewish territory. It would be kind of like saying somebody here in the United States is talking to Americans or Texans, because we're in Texas. But it doesn't mean I'm not talking to everybody. Jesus was talking to all humanity. He was talking to everybody. He was saying, come. Swindoll quotes a theologian, William Barclay. He says, to Jews, religion was a thing of endless rules. People lived their lives in an endless forest of regulations which dictated every action. Can't you just remember Tevyev of Fiddler on the Roof? And the good book says, I have to do this. I can hear the Jewish say. And the law says, I have to do this. Jesus, you know, why do we celebrate the 10 Commandments? Because there's only 10 of them. How many of you have, think back, don't show your hands, but how many of you have your kids, after you told them you have to do this and do that and do something or other, you know, they make some kind of comment like, oh, Dad, you just have all this stuff I have to do. One of the greatest things I ever did as a father, when my kids were little, kindergarten through about third grade, we were involved in the YMCA Indian Guides Indian Princess program. And we'd meet once a month, and the kids would, glue beads on a piece of paper or do something, color it in. And the dads would plan a camp out. But when we got to the camp out, one of the greatest things was I would drive in the car with my son or daughter, or sometimes two of them if they were both the same age. And we have an hour and a half drive with nobody else in the car. Didn't have video games, didn't have iPhone, didn't have the radio. It was just me and my daughter, or just me and my son. And when we got there, there really wasn't a whole lot of activity. We built a campfire, everybody stood around it. We'd go for a walk, but it was just time together with my children. I didn't have a lot of rules. The women, the mothers, were generally discouraged from coming. The kids would, they might wash their hands once or twice on the trip. Usually at around March, we'd have a camp out and the wives were invited. They were always aghast at, that fell on the ground. You let him eat it. What are you doing? They didn't wash their hands before they ate. And the kids would just kind of roll their eyes. They'd whisper, does Mom have to come on this? Jesus said, there's another way. Learn from me. Take my yoke. Marvin Vincent, who was a Presbyterian minister at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, said the yoke of the law was a metaphor for misinterpretation, alteration, and augmentation of God's laws. Jesus is saying, you're beat down, you're tired, you're worn out, you're burned out with religion. Come to me. It's not important. It's easy. It's not hard to follow Jesus Christ. All you got to do is come to me. It was interesting that in the first century, the rabbis used the word, the phrase, take the yoke of, and it was often used to refer to a student who was following a particular teacher. In the Middle Ages, you hear about such and such a painter who was in the school of Michelangelo or somebody. This is part of what the rabbis did in the first century. If you were under the yoke of a person, you were following that person. So Jesus is telling us a couple things. Back to Swindoll. Why? Where did these words come from? I want you to be my student. I want you to be following me. Swindoll talks about strivers. Anybody know what a striver is? It's somebody who is just working to get ahead. You've probably seen them in person. You certainly see them on TV and in movies and on social media. To put a good spin on it, a striver is someone with that dogged, relentless struggle and fueled by a volatile mixture of pride, perfectionism, and self-sufficiency. Sometimes we call them self-made men, driven women, firebrand, a visionary, type A personality, a mover, a shaker. Sometimes they have different connotations. Unsatisfied, greedy, power hungry, frustrated. Any of you, don't show hands, any of you have had a boss who was a striver? Are they fun to work for? Swindoll says that all strivers find that no amount of energy that they expend will ever get them everything they want. You're just not going to get there because they're just driven. They want more and more and more. Even Solomon acknowledged this. He said in Ecclesiastes, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Are we chasing the wind? John says, I have come that you might have life, and that you might have it more abundantly. God's rest, his Sabbath, is not just working. It's stopping to take time to be with God. That's what it's all about. Are you strivers? Is there a bit of the striver in you? Strivers, we challenge ourselves because we all want to do more. We encourage our children to have self-esteem. But do we sometimes take that too far? What's the right amount? Sometimes you ever think that something you want to ask for is too small to ask God? Well, I'll deal with that. I don't need to ask God. I stubbed my toe the other day. I don't need to pray God about my stubbed toe. When your child was really little and they stubbed their toe, did they ever want to come and sit in your lap? If it's good enough for your child and you, just think how much more it's good enough for God. Again, remember those words. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give my rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Just like at Jesus' time, today, Jesus is calling you. He's inviting you. He's inviting all of us. He wants you to rest with him, to rejoice with him, to count on him. What is it that we count on God? And it's not just on the Sabbath. It's not just on Sunday. It's every day. We want to count on God. Let's pray. Dear God, we just thank you that you have come and are still coming and inviting us to you. Help us to take up that yoke